So Bill C-32 is about to pass in Canada, bringing a whole host of changes to the country, along with 2 new taxes that are being implemented for the very first time as a result of this bill. Now, one of these taxes is trying to change Canadians' behavior, and the other one is trying to raise $6.1 billion for the Canadian government over the next 5 years. But there are some major criticisms that point out that, hey, some of these taxes might not work, and in some cases, some of these taxes might not go far enough. So let's talk about what these taxes are, when they're set to be implemented, and some of the concerns that people have about them. So let's get right into it. This is the first new tax, and it's aimed at the real estate market in Canada, trying to cool things off a little bit and discourage certain behavior. By the way, if you haven't already done so, make sure to subscribe to the channel so that you can keep on getting Canadian-focused updates just like this one. Now, the main goal of this tax is to make it so that less people are incentivized to purchase properties in Canada, hold them for a short period of time, do some cosmetic renovations, and sell it for a dramatic profit.
Every Canadian has the right to a place to call home. Housing shouldn't become a speculative asset. Homes should be for Canadian families. And so this anti-flipping tax is a measure designed to ensure precisely that.
This anti-flipping tax doesn't actually charge the flippers any set percentage of their sale or a set flat amount. No, instead they try to change the way that this income is qualified, and as a result, they are able to bring in a whole bunch more money from these flippers. Let me explain. You might not know that in Canada, the amount that you earn on an investment, the amount that that investment grows before you sell it, well, that income is taxed way differently than the income that you or I might make when we're working at a job. We're going to use nice round numbers for this example to make the math easy for me because I'm not that great at math. Let's say for this example that you made $100,000 in normal income, either from your own personal business or working a job. Obviously not a typical salary, but it's a nice number to work with for me. Well, on that $100,000, you'd be taxed on 100% of that, right? All of that is going to be taxed at your income tax rate, your marginal income tax rate. Now, depending on where you are and a number of other things, this could leave you with, in the end, roughly $60,000 to $70,000 after tax. But if you were to instead make that $100,000 not from your job, but make it from the growth of an investment, well, things are treated quite a lot differently. And this is for any investment, right? This could be in stocks. Maybe you purchased a bunch of stock and the value went up by $100,000 across your entire portfolio. Or maybe you bought a property and its value went up for $100,000 and you sold it. Well, things are a lot different here than if it was normal income. Instead of being taxed 100% on that $100,000 of income, you'd only be taxed on half of the income that you've made from capital gains. So you're only taxed on 50% for this capital gain. So you get to keep $50,000 of this tax-free. So you're only taxed on $50,000 of that $100,000. So you get to keep the first $50,000, and then maybe after tax, you'd be looking at, with that original $50,000 that you weren't taxed on, plus the $50,000 that you were taxed on, maybe you'd be looking at something between $75,000 and $85,000 after tax. And then there is a unique situation, and this is called your primary residence exemption, that if you buy a house and it's your only house and it's the one that you live in long term and you sell it and you make $100,000, well, you're actually taxed on 0% of that gain. You get to keep it all. So it makes a big difference whether the income you make from something is considered normal income or business income, or if it's something that falls under capital gains. Now, depending on how you manage your investments, whether this is in stocks or real estate or any other investment, well, whether or not your investment income is qualified as capital gains or as normal income, again, is depending on the way that you manage your portfolio. And that's exactly what this tax is trying to do, moving house flippers out of that capital gains area where they're taxed far less and moving all of the gains on all of the properties that they flip into that normal income range so that the government can tax them at a far higher rate. So that's what the government of Canada is trying to do. They're saying that any home that is owned for 365 consecutive days or less and is sold, well, that income is going to be automatically not considered capital gains income, but automatically go into that business income or normal income category. Now, if these flippers were always following things to the rules to a T, this would already be the way that they would qualify their business income from flipping. They wouldn't claim this as capital gains because they're running an active flipping business. And because it's a business, that's business income, just like active day traders have to pay full business income on their gains instead of claiming this as capital gains. But the problem lies in the default assumption over these properties. See, right now, the onus is on the Canadian Revenue Agency to prove that a taxpayer is carrying on business of flipping a property that would be subject to the full taxation as business income, right? So right now the CRA assumes that if you're flipping a house, well, like the base assumption is that it is not something that's business income, and the CRA has to actually actively prove that you are running a business in order to say, hey, you can't qualify as capital gains under that. You have to pay full income tax here. Now, obviously the change that's happening with this legislation is saying anything under 365 days, that is a flip, and that is business income every single time. So the whole point is to make flipping less desirable for people because they'd have to pay higher amounts in tax. But the question still remains, just how effective will that be? Will flippers still see the ability to make profit and continue at the same rate? Well, here's what the Parliamentary Budget Officer has to say on this issue. This is the guy that gets sent all of these new bills, and then his nonpartisan sort of separate committee, separate team determines, well, is this actually going to work, and here's how much it's going to work outside of being attached to any sort of political party.
And we believe that there will be a significant portion of those who are currently flipping houses that when they hear the word additional tax to be paid, that will be sufficient to discourage them. Others will think that there's still good enough money to be made that it's worth proceeding and engaging in these transactions.
You see, he thinks that 50% of the people who would be impacted by this change in category of income, well, 50% of them would delay their disposition to avoid being taxed under the new rule. In plain English, that just means hold it past a year, hold it longer than 365 days to just skip over this rule entirely. But they note that with this 50-50 number, half of the people who would hold it and half of the people that would just pay the tax, that there's a considerable uncertainty surrounding this number because there's not really any historical data to look at to determine how many people would react to a tax like this. But even if this does prevent people from getting into flipping in the first place, it's questionable about whether or not this will actually have an impact on housing prices. Here's some data that was just put out by the Bank of Canada, I think about a week and a half ago, and it shows the percentage of homes that are actively flipped in the market for every individual major city in Canada, as well as if I just click here, we can see the average across all of Canada, right? This is looking at homes that were flipped within the first 6 months of owning the home. And you can see it sort of hovers in the 1.24 percentage to just under 1 percentage point of all Canadian homes are sold in under 6 months, just 1%. And if we flip that up to 12 months, the one that's most impactful for this rule, we can see that at maximum back in 2018, when there was the highest amount of flipping going on, well, we saw 2.61% of all homes in Canada sold within the first year. So that's the average in Canada. Right now we're seeing 2.44%. So not a huge amount of homes on the market that are being flipped in under a year. And another reason that I wonder about the actual impact that this will have on home prices, and why I think it could be a little bit lackluster if you're looking for this to try to cool the housing market further, is that, well, a lot of the people who are actively flipping aren't getting their properties from the MLS or the place that realtors will list their properties, right? Most flippers will look off market to buy their properties. They'll either send out their own flyers, knock on doors, look for people that maybe are embarrassed about their home, they're hoarders, and try to buy properties from them, or they'll go to someone called a wholesaler that will do all that legwork and find these deals, these off-market deals for them. Those wholesalers bring it to the flipper buys the contract from the wholesaler, and then they essentially do an entirely off-market transaction. So it's questionable in my eyes on whether or not these properties that the flippers are actually working on would have been listed on the MLS if they weren't flipped. It's certainly going to be interesting to watch these numbers going forward, and I'm curious what you think. Let me know in the comments, but that's not the only tax we're talking about today. We're also going to talk about somewhat of a windfall tax that is happening in Canada. The idea here is that over the past couple of years, there have been certain companies that have made more profits than they were expecting, and that some of that might have been a result of what the Canadian government did in the past. Now, the idea here is that we're going to tax those companies more heavily, at least for a short-term period of time, to try to get a bunch more money for the Canadian government so that they can execute more social policy or just have less of a deficit. This was inside Budget 2022, the fiscal budget that was provided by Chrystia Freeland in April of 2022, and this policy is just getting implemented now, just at the very end of November, right? So we're seeing how long it takes for some of these legislative changes to actually happen. It started in April, and now it's finally getting implemented. But this is talking about the Canada Recovery Dividend, where only these two types of companies are going to be paying it: banking and life insurance. Those two sectors have to pay 15% tax on all of the income that they made over $1 billion in 2021. So those companies could make $1 billion and pay whatever their normal tax rate would be on that income. But for any amount they made over $1 billion, well, they have to pay an additional 15% tax, a one-time tax on that amount over $1 billion. And long term, again, only for these two very unique sectors, banking and life insurance groups, any income that is made over $100 million, and this is every single year moving forward, will have an increased tax rate from 15% to 16.5%, a 1.5% increase on income over $100 million each and every single year. And they're expecting these new measures to raise the government $6.1 billion over 5 years. Now, this has largely been something that the NDP have been calling for heavily. Jagmeet Singh and his NDP have been saying, hey, we need to tax these large corporations. They might be part of the reason that we're seeing so much inflation. He actually has termed the coin greedflation, pointing at profiteering in these large businesses. But the NDP looked at this tax and said, hey, why are you only doing this for bankers and for life insurance providers? Don't you think that you should apply this to other things, like especially what they've been commenting on lately, like grocery stores that have been making more profits as of late? It's certainly something the NDP have been touching on. Here's what Daniel Blaikie asked Chrystia Freeland just in a finance committee meeting the other day. He asked, well, like, why we want to work with you. We want to expand this windfall tax, this Canada Recovery Dividend, out to other businesses that may have profited from the higher cost of living. And here's why Chrystia Freeland thinks that maybe that's not such a good idea to do.
When we know there are industries that are making, where businesses are making a lot of extra profit on the very essentials that Canadians are having a harder time affording.
When it comes to the specific principle and the specific question around the COVID recovery dividend and which sectors it should be levied on, and when it comes to the COVID recovery dividend, the justification was as follows: that when COVID hit Canada, when we shut down our country's economy as a result, the government undertook emergency economic action. We basically put a floor under the whole Canadian economy, and all Canadians paid for that. There was a particular sector that benefited from that government action, a particular sector of the economy, and that was the financial sector, which would have suffered significantly had the government not acted. So that was our rationale. I think that it is robust and it stands up. Part of tax fairness, from my perspective, is that we have to be really careful when it comes to tax policy to be sure there's a clear, sound justification for new taxes, particularly one-off taxes which are levied.
So she says particularly the reason that they're not including other businesses that may have made over $1 billion is that, well, the actions of the government at the beginning of the pandemic prevented the life insurers, I guess, for some reason, as well as definitely I agree with this, bankers and large banks. Well, it prevented them from entering a very severe recession where they wouldn't have been able to earn as much money as they did. So the government says, hey, we allowed you to make this profit because of these the extreme actions action we took and all of the benefits and supports we provided. So we're going to require you to pay this Canada Recovery Dividend. And to extrapolate a little bit from what she says, hey, we got to be really careful on what tax policy we put into place. And I think that by this, she's meaning like, hey, if we just start doing after the fact one-time taxes on businesses, well, our business is really going to want to expand and grow in Canada if we are sort of viewed as this country that, well, like can just willy-nilly throw an extra $100 million of tax on you here and $100 million of tax on you there. I think this is what she's getting at. But I know that the NDP will be frustrated in this, saying, hey, we need to tax as many people as possible who are making a lot of profit to cover this cost of living crisis and provide social supports and programs for the average Canadians. But I'm curious what you think about it. Do you agree with the NDP on that point, or do you think that the Liberals' route here is the right way to go? And also on the flipping tax, do you think that it's even going to do anything at all, or do you think that it's actually going to have an effect on Canadian housing prices, giving more people a place to live? Either way, let me know down in the comment section. I read every single one, try to get back to a bunch of them, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. It's free, it's one click, and it helps out the channel dramatically. But with all of that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. Really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.